All right. Cool. Hi, I'm Tyler Van Haren. I'm an engineer here at Statsig, and today I'll be talking to you about holdouts. So, before we get too deep into what a holdout is in Statsig, how to set it up, let's talk about why. So, when you're running many experiments over the course of a half, a pretty reasonable question to ask is, what was the sort of cumulative impact of that, right? I can look at any of these individual experiments and say, oh, I think I raised this thing by 5%, and then this experiment raised it by like 2%, and then this experiment raised it by like 3%, right? But then the question of sort of, okay, how do those play together? How do they play off each other is a pretty reasonable one to ask, right? Should I then expect that it's going to be like a 12% impact? Just adding up those percentages? Should I like multiply them together? Are they going to be stronger because of each other? Are they going to be weaker because of each other? So like some cannibalization going on. These are all really hard questions to ask, or to answer rather, and easy to ask. And so a holdout is a way to actually just measure that. We're actually just going to say, hey, some percentage of users, we're just not going to give this set of experiments. And then we get to measure them as just its own experiment, right? Is it better to be in the group that didn't get these new things or that did get these new things? Hopefully did. And you can even actually use multiple holdouts, right? You might have a team level holdout and then a company level holdout, for instance. Just sort of, again, attributing out, okay, like this team did these things over the half, and then this company did these things over the half. And then one final thing worth calling out about holdouts is it's really useful as a way to sort of abstract out what your company is doing versus what like sort of macro conditions are doing, right? If everyone is purchasing less dollars worth on your platform, it might be reasonable to say, hey, like, did we make our platform worse, or are people just purchasing less things in general? The holdout is a way to sort of abstract out, here is what we did this half, and then here is what would have happened if we didn't do anything this half, and compare the two. So when we're setting up a holdout on Statsig, we're saying, yes, here's some small percentage of users that are not going to get any of this collection of gates or experiments. One experiment can respect multiple holdouts, but it's just another small percentage of users that also won't get that experiment. When any experiment or gate in the holdout is checked, that'll count as being exposed to the holdout. There's some chance that that user that checked it is in the holdout and won't get that thing. We actually differentiate out in our UI and even in our math a little bit into three groups, really. We say, here's some percentage of folks who are in the holdout that is your control. These are the people not getting your experience. Here's the rest, 1 minus X, are the people who are not in the holdout. They're getting all of these experiences that you're experimenting on. We're actually going to say, let's take another X% and use that as like our test group. The reason we do that balance is just to reduce the false positive rate. When you have these like insanely imbalanced experiments, right? If I'm running a 99.1, you actually get a slightly elevated false positive rate, so we'll actually treat it as like a 1%, 1%. Just a common confusion point, I guess, of coming to this holdout and seeing these like three groups. It's still two groups that we're comparing against each other. We're just explicitly calling out, here's other exposures that happened, but they're not getting used for the math there. And so once you've created your holdout in Statsig, you'll be met with this sort of settings window where you can actually go and manage the holdout. You can go and add individual experiments here, or gates or layers. The other thing that you can do is you can actually toggle this global holdout flag, especially if you're like a relatively small company, or it's like, maybe your project on Statsig is only your team. The global holdout is a really convenient way to just say, yes, I want everything to get captured. All the new experiments that I get added to Statsig that match this unit type, they're just going to count towards this holdout. And then you don't really have to worry about chasing people down and being like, hey, remember to add your experiment to the holdout before you start it, things like that. Even as like a quite large company, when you're adding those company level holdouts, this is a really convenient way to enforce that across everyone. And folks can go and remove them if they need to. And so when a experiment or gate or etc. is added to the holdout, that means that some small percentage of users, whatever holdout percent you choose, are going to get default values. For an experiment, this is defaults in code. So that is to say, if the experiment hasn't started yet, you have some default defined in code that determines exactly what you'll give to the user. So it's like some relatively safe thing. It represents like sort of your control experience, right? Not the thing you're testing. That is what we will fall back to for experiments. For gates, we will just fall back to false. We view false as the safest option. Thinking of it like a feature, true is get the feature, false is don't get the feature. So we'll just say, yes, these people will not get the feature. Like all these new features you're adding, they just won't get them. That is our way of having very standardized defaults for gates. For layers, on the layer, you'll actually have the option to go and configure what it means to be in the default experience for that layer, just because layers are something that sort of spans multiple halves, often controlling all of these configurations for a surface. So what we'll actually do is we'll sort of snapshot the default values at time of adding that layer, and then just make sure that people keep getting those values. And then once you are ready to clean things up, you can actually go and remove these, and then those users will start sort of joining the rest of your user base. And so at the end of your half or quarter or year, you'll be met with a pulse results page, just like you'd get for an experiment or a gate. This will actually just compare, here's the impact of everything you did this half versus what if you didn't do those. This is your way to sort of measure what metrics improved and what metrics deproved. For instance, you might have moved up actual like revenue, which is good, but moved slightly down how many times people added to cart. Maybe that's fine. Maybe people were just adding things to cart and abandoning them, and you removed some of those sessions but still improved the conversion funnel. That's fine. But yeah, it's just your way to go and actually measure those things. We treat the test group, thinking through a normal experiment, not in the holdout, aka getting all of the new features over the course of the half, is the test group, and then control is that small percentage of control users who just didn't get the things from this half. There's a few best practices to sort of talk through for holdouts. The first is size. We recommend a relatively low single-digit percentage, 1 to 5 is sort of the range that most people will fall into here. There's a little bit of a balancing act here, right? If I made my holdout group 0.001%, then I probably just don't have enough power to actually get data over the course of the half on if I improved things or not. So then I sort of did it for no reason. But on the other hand, like, we think that the things we're shipping are good, right? So we want to keep as relatively small as possible the set of users that we're not giving those things to. There's a few pretty famous stories of holdouts. I think both Facebook and Google have had these come out, where like they had some like ads holdout, right? Where just some percentage of users were not getting ads in their product, like ever, which is really useful as a holdout, because it means that like you're actually measuring, hey, is adding these ads experiences making our product sufficiently worse that people are not using it anymore, right? But that's obviously some percentage of user base that you're not running ads on. So you're like obviously not making revenue off of them. So you wouldn't want it to set it to like a 50-50 test, for instance, right? So finding that sort of balancing point is pretty useful there. Another useful thing to talk through is duration. We are of the opinion that most of the time your holdout should run for like a quarter or a half, maybe a year as the top end. We don't think there's a ton of value in running like a 5-year holdout or a 10-year holdout. You might collect a lot of really interesting data, but it's worth noting that it's like the same cohort of users in the holdout the entire time, right? So if I develop my product for 5 years, I just took some 5% of users and didn't give them any product updates for 5 years, which is not great. And B, those set of users might start behaving pretty differently from your actual user base. So it's no longer like as fair of a comparison, right? Even thinking back to that ads example, I would have to imagine that if I used a product that is normally ad-based without ads for 5 years, I would start using it in a very different fashion over time as I sort of learn, like, this is my experience that I'm living in. And then final call out here is that holdouts are a pretty effective way to add a back test for something. If I have some experiment or gate that I have already launched, and then I really want to go and measure the impact of that experiment or gate, a year down the line or something, a holdout can be a pretty simple way to take some 5% of users and just be like, okay, what if you didn't get this thing that we've already launched? It's worth noting there that that means there is some percent of users that you're actually like taking this thing away from, right? So we generally advise against that as much as possible, but sometimes you just need that measurement, right? Especially if, for instance, you're weighing taking this thing away, it's probably best that you actually measure taking that thing away before you go and do it, right? But yeah, that's holdouts. They're a really powerful tool, especially as you want to sort of measure aggregate impact of multiple experiments, what your team is doing, what your company is doing over the course of a half, and actually being able to differentiate that from just changes in general user behavior. Thanks.